And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you. The story of the day, clearly, not just AIG giving $100 million, and it's probably going to be closer to $400 million before it's all done, in bonuses to the guys who brought down the country. But how did this come about? I mean, back in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, George Akerlof, who later would win a Nobel Prize for economics, wrote a report about something very similar that happened in Texas that involves some S&Ls and land speculation. He titled it "Looting," and he said that the banking industry and the absent strong regulation by government, what would be happening? What had happened in Texas on Reagan's watch, and what would continue. And geez, was this when George Bush was governor? I think it might have been a little before that, but in any case, on Reagan's watch. And what would continue to happen at a national level was that we would be looted, that the bankers would internalize the profits and externalize the costs, because they knew that the moral hazard was not theirs, it was the taxpayers. And so maybe there's an area here where the left and the right, the libertarians and the liberals, the conservatives and the Democrats and whatnot, maybe there's some common ground, maybe not. I'm not sure. It's going to be an interesting one to find out. Let's bring in Yaron Brook. He is the president and executive director of the Ayn Rand Institute, AYNRAND.org. Ayn Rand, of course, the author of Atlas Shrugged, the book that started the modern-day objectivist movement, which has inspired the modern-day libertarian movement and much of the Norquist arm of the conservative movement, although, of course, Yaron, you disavow all those guys. They are not purist enough for you.
No, and they have a very different agenda than the objectivist or the Ayn Rand agenda. By the way, did you catch my op-ed about Atlas Shrugged in the Wall Street Journal this weekend?
I'm sorry, my weekend was wiped out and I was on airplanes. And
you should check it out. It's good.
I will look for it. Did you see the piece on Ayn Rand that was over at Huffington Post a couple of weeks ago?
Unfortunately, I did. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm assuming you wrote the rebuttal, right?
Haven't yet, but we're working on it.
Okay, so here we have AIG. This company was writing, it turns out, trillions of dollars worth of these credit default swaps, and the loans based on them. I mean, trillions of dollars worth of this stuff. And in fact, as far as we can tell, this market went from zero in 1998 to 45 trillion in mid-2007, according to the International Swaps and Derivatives Association. That's twice the size of the U.S. stock market. It exceeds the $7 trillion mortgage market, the $4 trillion U.S. Treasuries market. Keep in mind the GDP of the entire United States is only about $15 trillion. This was $45 trillion that these guys wrote. Bill Seidman, the guy who invented these things, talks about how when they were first, he invented them as head of the Resolution Trust Corporation as a way of disposing of the assets of the failed S&Ls. Only he did it in a way that was totally transparent and that could not be gamed like this. But then he went to the SEC and to the Fed and to the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, and said, we've got to regulate this stuff. If we don't regulate this stuff, it's going to be a disaster. And here's just a 1-minute clip you're on, and then I'd like to get into a conversation with you about what should have been done, of Bill Seidman talking about how this came about, what happened when he went to Alan Greenspan and he said, we've got to regulate these credit default swaps and these derivatives.
It was proposed that their regulation, or at least disclosure, be required. And the industry fought it, and the Federal Reserve, under Alan Greenspan,
who was his friend, by the way,
vehemently opposed. And they made the argument, which you hear all the time, and I can remember Alan saying, look, these are sophisticated contracts between knowledgeable buyers and knowledgeable sellers. No regulator can do as well as they'll do So what do you need a regulator for? The market will regulate these. And he won the day. So among the list of our friends, along with me and others, Alan was clearly, I'd say, the key person responsible for the fact that we didn't even know how many of those contracts there were, and they were up in the trillions. So when AIG got in trouble, it turned out that they had one division with 400 people in it. They had 80,000 employees. They had 400 people in one division. They wrote all these contracts. They didn't report any of them. So they were, you'd say, gambling by writing these contracts. And when things started to go bad and they had to pay on these contracts, the whole monster, the largest insurance company in the world, went under.
And those 400 people now are up for what ultimately may be $400 million in bonuses on top of the hundreds of millions, perhaps billions of dollars that they've already been paid. Yaron, Brook, how could an objectivist, or by extension a libertarian or a conservative or anybody, justify this absolute lack of government control over this totally free enterprise, this totally laissez-faire market?
Well, the problem is that we had too much government control. I mean, the problem is that there is no market to regulate these people. So, for example, when they got into trouble and they should have gone bankrupt and lost their jobs and sued for maybe fraud or whatever it is that they did, the government, instead of that, stepped in and bailed these guys out, which is absurd and ridiculous. And now, of course, they should be government employees, and as far as I'm concerned, should be paid like government employees. They're getting outrageous bonuses underwritten.
I think they should be living in tents in homeless cities, in these bushvilles that are being created all over the country. I'm agreeing with you on that, Yaron. But here's the problem: that this thing came into being in the first place as a consequence of the philosophy that you're espousing. In my humble opinion,
that's simply wrong. Because first of all, in a true free market, we don't know what would have happened. You know, I've agreed with you that the regulated mixed economy has failed.
But there was no regulation here.
Sure, there was regulation. There was regulation on every other aspect of the financial market. So you can't take this in isolation and say this is a product of free market. But let's go back to the facts.
Why not?
$44 trillion of CDOs is a very misleading number. That is a notional value of these CDOs. That's like saying the life insurance contracts in the United States are for X trillion dollars. Sure, that's the notional value there. Most of those contracts will never be paid. Most of these CDOs are fine. 90% of these CDOs are plus. There's no problem with. What ING did was they did some what's called naked
you mean AIG?
Contracts. AIG did these naked contracts, which they lost money on, and they should have gone bankrupt. I mean, that's how the market works. When you make mistakes, when you gamble, you go bankrupt. That's exactly how a market capitalism works. There's nothing wrong with going bankrupt.
But if they went bankrupt, you had the state of California invested their asset. You had 28 states that were heavily invested with this.
Well, shouldn't those states have thought about who they were invested in?
They did.
Due diligence? No, they didn't. I've seen how CalPERS invest. Believe me, I do private equity. They are dumb investors, and indeed they are political entities. They invest based more on political considerations than financial ones. I mean, if CalPERS loses money, then they deserve to lose money. They made bad investments. They should lose money. That's how. Look, either we want capitalism.
Let's take this back. Let's look at this from 30,000 feet here, Yaron. Yeah. When this investment vehicle was created, these collateralized debt obligations and the derivatives that could be derived from them, and the credit default swaps that actually started the thing, and then the CDOs, and then the derivatives. When these were all invented by William Seidman, he went to both the SEC under Reagan and Bush and the Fed and said there either has to be regulation of these, or there at least has to be reporting, some listing of them, so we know, so an investor can be informed how much of this stuff is out there. What is it? Where is it coming from? And they said, no, this is our opportunity to test the true free market. And it blew up in their face.
Well, but it didn't blow up in their face. The fact that a company went bankrupt doesn't say that the system blew up. CDOs are an incredibly valuable tool in the free markets out there. The fact that one company went bankrupt is not proof that the CDO market is a bad market. The problem is that we don't let companies that go bankrupt. You know, let the market really work. And then let's test how well it does or doesn't do. We've got to mix.
Yaron, you want to stick around for a minute? And we'll
Absolutely.
okay, thanks a lot. Yaron Brook, IronRand.org.